So welcome everyone. My name is Heather Meadows Adamson. I'm a premium tutor here at Applerouth. So tonight we're going to talk about navigating the college admissions process, which is a lot of stuff. Just keep in mind, this is going to be a lot of info tonight. So here is briefly before we talk about what we're going to talk about tonight. So at Applerouth, we believe that when you change student self-beliefs, you change their lives. That's our overall kind of impetus here. Oops, too far. We also focus on building skills for school and beyond that. So not just tutoring, test prep, but also increasing confidence, building good habits as well. So tonight we're going to talk about, like I said, a lot of stuff. Talk about types of college applications, what goes in an application. Then, of course, a big part of that, the SAT versus the ACT, how to prepare for testing, how testing has changed after the pandemic. And then we'll have time at the end for questions. I'll just ask if you hold your kind of specific questions to the end. I probably will cover a lot of them. But I'm happy to take any questions at the end. But yeah, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about types of applications first. Some of you be like, maybe like, oh, I didn't even know there was more than one type. I thought you just applied. You're totally not alone there. It's a little complicated and who knows why, but here it is. So there's kind of three large types of applications. One that you're most familiar with is regular admissions at a regular deadline. And that is just, the deadline pretty much for everyone to apply there, right? Some more interesting ones you have are early and then rolling admissions. So we're going to start with the early ones. Those are a little bit more complicated. So early admissions are then split into two categories below that, early action and early decision. The difference between these two is really important. So early action is kind of what it sounds like, early action, right? You are just applying as an early applicant. There are some pros and cons to that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But nothing's really binding unless they tell you, right? There's a restricted one. Most of them, though, are going to be unrestricted early action. You're just applying early. Often those applications are shorter. Often, we'll talk about again in a minute, kind of in the testing or post-pandemic, there can be a chance to get in if you are kind of on the cusp of the requirements. Early decision is different, right? So decision, right? That kind of helps us figure out what this one is. You are deciding you want to go to that school. An early decision application is saying that you promise you're only applying to this one school early, and you promise if you are accepted, you will go to that school. So again, that is binding, and that's something to consider here. So those are kind of two big differences there. You want to make sure you're looking at all of these. And again, all the schools that do early in action and early decision also do regular deadlines too. So you don't have to do that binding application. Some students may want to for some other reasons though, right? Rolling admissions means they continuously take students over a period of time. So that, they start taking kids then as they get applications, they just let people in as they get applications. So it's obviously a little better the earlier you apply, right? There are more spots, but it also means that, you can apply to those much later than you can apply to a lot of the other schools too. So when it comes to applying to what colleges, one size definitely does not fit all, right? You may want to apply regular admissions to some schools. You may want to apply early action to some, early decision. Well, early decision, you can only apply to one, too, right? You may want to apply rolling to another, right? And it's okay, right? It just depends on what programs you're looking at and kind of which school you prefer at the end of the day. Let's talk about those early ones a little more specifically, right? Early action, you're not committing to a school. Some schools do have restricted early action. That's not super common. Most of them allow you to apply to as many early as you like. Early decision is binding, right? So you are committing to attend that school if you are accepted. So again, keep those in mind. And again, you don't have to apply early decision if you don't want to anywhere. Totally just an option. Rolling's a little different. They just accept students over the course of months, and they'll stop when they filled up all their spaces, right? You'll get notifications a few weeks after they receive your application, whenever that is, right? Again, they're better odds if you apply early because there are simply more spots, right? But rolling admissions is definitely good too, right? Because typically, again, they admit students way after most regular deadlines, right? So Alabama has one of these that does this. And lastly, regular admission. Sometimes they have priority deadlines. So it's kind of like an early regular, right? So you'll see this is an example here, November 1st. Some conditions may apply, right? Only US applicants can do that at University of Texas. Some of them have specific things going on. But other than that, regular is just regular admissions, the regular application you would expect. Okay. Priority and regular are usually in the late fall or early spring of your senior year. Those early ones are typically going to be in about around October-ish, I would say. So those are different kinds of applications. What goes in those applications, right? So, obviously, we do a lot of testing here at Applerouth Test Prep. So we'll talk about testing, right? US schools still put a premium on testing at the end of the day. This survey is from 2017, so obviously things have changed lately, but they haven't changed too crazy, right? So we see here, this was a survey of schools asking them what influences their admissions decisions. Of course, grades in all courses and grades in specific college prep courses that would exclude like electives are really huge for most schools. The strength of your curriculum, right? Are you taking difficult classes are also big for many schools. And test scores are still up there. And so even though test scores may have dropped a little bit since the pandemic, you see this next thing is 18%. There's no way it dropped below that, right? At the end of the day, it is still one of the top 4 things many schools are going to look at. There are quantitative and there are qualitative pieces of your application. So the quantitative things are your high school GPA, schedule strength, right? AP tests, things that have numbers, right? SAT, ACT. Qualitative things are things that don't have numbers, right? Essays, recommendations, activities, interests, right? So the idea is to take those numbers, those quantitative pieces, and to use those qualitative pieces to take those numbers and tell a story with it, right? That's kind of what we'll talk about a lot throughout the evening is how does your application tell a story that makes sense, right? That's what you want to do. You want to take all these different pieces and you want to craft a story of yourself as a student, right? So curricular strength is really important, right? So this is a really interesting chart. This is student participation in AP programs by years. So if you look here, 2016, 2017, over 2.7 million students took AP exams. If you look, again, this is a little while ago, I'm sure it's increased, right? About 10 years before that, it was 1.5 million. More students are taking AP, IB, dual enrollment classes every single year, right? So again, this is something that's almost become a really key part of your application. Pretty much 100% increase in tests and students in 10 years. So you want to make sure you're balancing things though, right? You want to balance course rigor and GPA, right? So course rigor is taking honors, AP classes, things like that. And, also performance and other things, right? So taking an AP class, but getting a C in it is not performance, right? It is better off for you to take just an honors class or something and get an A and take an AP and get a C, right? If you are starting to push into that world, A's and B's are what demonstrates success in those classes. So you want to balance those, right? This is a balance. Are those, am I stronger in English or stronger in math? Maybe those are the courses I take the APs in. The ones I'm not as strong in, I take just the honors or just the regular class. So at the end of the day, I want to look like I'm a successful student. And, I'm pushing myself in the places I can, but I'm not pushing myself in the places where I'm not ready yet as well, right? Again, what's the story there on your transcript? So for example, a 3.5 GPA can tell a lot of different stories. This is really interesting. I really like this. So this first one, this green line, right, is a late bloomer. You had some trouble freshman year. Maybe you had something personal going on. That's totally fine. But over time, you increase those grades. And by the time you get to junior, senior year, you are acing it. That's great, right? And again, that's something to tell a story about in your application. The blue line, right? Really consistent student. That's great, right? You did consistent throughout. The black line struggling, right? Maybe you are pushing yourself to take too many APs your junior, senior year. Maybe you had trouble in Algebra 1, so that math core is just not there. You're having trouble in pre-cal and other things too, right? So even though you may have a 3.5 at the end of all the story because you did really well freshman year, that's something you want to be able to tell why is this happening, right? Or maybe something you want to think about too. Maybe I need to take fewer AP classes. Maybe I need to get some tutoring. Maybe I need to work with something, get some extra credit, something, right? I need something to bump this GPA up at the end of the day. But on paper, all these students do have 3.5s, right? That's interesting. But don't forget, the schools do get your whole transcript. They may not read into the whole thing, but you want to make sure you're telling those stories and explaining those patterns they may see on your application. So upward trends are your friends, right? It's totally fine. You had a little bit of trouble freshman or sophomore year. That's okay, as long as you are seen to be improving, right? That's the thing. They want to see you improve and grow as a student. The essay, right? It's going to be a qualitative piece, right? The personal statement is one of the single most important things most students will write in high school. It offers a chance to turn you from a set of numbers into an actual human being, and you can share things that aren't seen in the application, right? Again, by explaining those grade trends, perhaps. A well-crafted essay can turn the application reader into an advocate, right? They're saying, I know this doesn't look great, but I read this essay and it really changed my mind about this student. So here's some common essay prompts. These are the most recent ones. So again, these are super common. So, you know, if you want to go ahead and prep for some of this, think about these common essay prompts. Think about what you would say there, right? What can you say about yourself here? So, you know, some students have a background, interest, talent that would be incomplete without that, you know, that their application would be incomplete without it. Share this, reflect on a time you challenged a belief, share an essay on any topic of your choice, right? So again, you have all these options to tell those stories, to talk about those patterns in the rest of your application. So the essay is definitely the place where you can weave the story together, weave all the pieces together. So extracurriculars, right? You not only want to do continuity, right? You don't want to join a bunch of clubs senior year, junior year. That doesn't look great. Find something you love and stick to it over time, right? Start it early. Yeah, right? It's better to be deeply involved in a couple activities than to just be a member in every club at school, but you don't really do anything, right? It's better to be secretary of one of them or treasurer of one of them or something like that, to actually be involved. And contribution, right? You should be actively involved, right? Take on a position with responsibilities. Have something to show for it. I worked and I planned this event and here's how it went, right? Again, spending more time on one or two activities rather than kind of being on the surface level of many looks so much better to these, to the readers of the applications. So change, right? So a student resume, this actually, oops. So a student resume is something that you kind of put on there, though I will say this can also be done in the essay portion as well, right? Kind of talking about all your different activities, right? Really the key here is you want to keep track of all the activities you've done over the course of your education. So you don't want to forget something you did freshman year, right? Maybe you planned a really big event your freshman year, and by the time you write these essays junior year, you totally forgot how that event went. Do this early on, right? Write down these things, keep track of any awards, recognition, accomplishments you're doing as you go throughout your high school career. So when it's time to do this later on, they're right there at the tip of your finger. So building a college list can be overwhelming, right? So talked about the types of applications and what goes in an application. But at the end of the day, you have to send those applications to somewhere, right? So really another big step you want to do, and this is also important when you're going into the testing area, testing cycle, you want to make a list of colleges you're thinking about. So here's some advice. There's some advice to narrow down a preliminary list. Take advantage of college fairs, school visits, and virtual tours. See lots of schools at once. It helps you narrow down some, helps you add some others you may not have known about. College visits, especially the local ones, is helpful. Even if you don't want to stay local, it can help you think about categories of schools, right? So even if you don't want to go to your local liberal arts school, at least go and see what the environment's like. It's really likely it's going to be similar to other liberal arts schools, right? Or again, for big state schools. Big state school, obviously they're different in their own ways, but at the end of the day, they're probably pretty similar in what they offer, right? So again, kind of thinking about those things, it can help you at least identify categories of schools. And then also talk to your family, right? What's the budget? Who's paying? Can I go in state or out? What majors are important to me, right? So what are things that are non-negotiable in my family? After that, you have that list, right? And that core list is where you can start looking up some stuff. You can start looking up what's the GPA of the students that get accepted. You can start looking up, do they offer that early decision? Was that something I may want to do, right? So once you build that college list, the rest of this makes a lot more sense, right? So that's my advice as you are really starting this process, is to build that college list first and then kind of go into the rest of the details. So speaking of that, let's talk about the testing part of this, right? And again, this is much easier if you have a college list in mind. So SAT and ACT, let's first talk about what the differences are between the tests. So they both really have a similar structure. Both have a reading section. Both have a writing, English grammar section. Both have math. The SAT has two math sections. One is without the calculator, one's with. ACT only has one. Then you'll see here on the right, the ACT has a science section that the SAT doesn't have. And the ACT also does still offer an optional essay. The SAT no longer does. So just a couple of small differences. But really 75 to 80% of the content overlaps between the two tests. They both test core reading comprehension skills, English grammar skills, being able to read graphs, interpret data, and then of course your basic algebra, stats, and a little bit of geometry that most, pretty much all schools are going to teach you. The SAT is going to have more advanced reading, and by that I mean the reading passages are going to be more complex, and the questions are going to be more complex. And there's more reading in the math as well, so there's more math word problems. The ACT is going to have more science, right? It simply has a science section, and the math is going to cover a larger variety of topics there too. So again, just some slight differences there, but the core skills are going to be the same between each test. Really, the biggest difference is the presentations, right? The amount of time per question. So if you look here, the SAT is a much more forgiving timing structure. You see here in every single section, you have more time per question on the SAT, a significant amount more time per question. But it's a more complicated test, right? I said the reading section on the SAT, the passages are more complex and so are the questions. So you get more time, but it could depend on your student, right? Would your student rather have to read harder passages in more time? Would they rather read a more approachable passage at a very fast pace, right? Kind of about presentation and what your student feels more confident in. So again, it's a more complicated test in other ways. So the math is also a little different, right? So you see on the SAT, about 62% of the questions are algebra based. So, there's still a solid amount of arithmetic, data analysis, stats, but there's just only a little bit of geometry and trig, right? If you're hearing this and you're like, good, I hated geometry, maybe the SAT is right for you. On the other hand, the ACT is more evenly split, right? So the ACT still has a lot of algebra, 46%, but 23% of that test is geometry. So again, right, if it's been a while since you've taken geometry, could be time to freshen up on that. So again, just differences in the presentation of the tests. Reading section is also a little different, right? So I talked about how the SAT is more complex, right? Oops, sorry. So even though the ACT is going to force students to go at a faster reading pace, the difficulty level is more consistent, right? Passages are all pretty much the same length or so. They're all the same difficulty. They're all about magazine article reading level. SAT, on the other hand, has difficulty spikes, right? The first one could be not too bad, but then you could get a passage from the 1700s, right? The next ones could be fine, but then the difficulty could go up again. So again, it's being able to deal with the spikes in difficulty as the reading goes in the SAT. In the ACT science, it's really unlike anything on the SAT. It has some science mixed into other spots, but the ACT has this dedicated science section. And at the end of the day, it's not truly testing your science knowledge. It's actually testing your ability to read about an experiment, to read data, to read results, and to interpret those results. So if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, I'm bad at science, don't stress, right? This is just reading results, right? So you don't need to remember all the stuff from your bio or chem class. You just need to be able to kind of be familiar with the scientific method and be able to read graphs pretty well. So those differences between the two tests, right? And the biggest thing you really want to do between those two tests is just take a practice test of both and get an idea of what they feel like, right? Many students have taken the PSAT in school. So often all you have to do is take a practice ACT or something just to get an idea of the differences between the two tests firsthand. But, after that, how do you actually go about taking them? SAT is pretty easy. You go to collegeboard.org. So College Board is the company that runs the SAT. They also run the PSAT and the AP exams. So if you ever take any of those, you already have an account. So you just go in there and you register for the SAT. Nothing too crazy. ACT is pretty simple too, which is a different company. It's ACT.org. So you have to do it there instead. If you do have accommodations, you want to make sure you're thinking about that. So accommodations is something that you may already receive in your school. If you have a learning difference like dyslexia or ADHD or something like that, right? So, maybe you get extra time on tests, maybe you get frequent breaks. There's lots of different options you may get. So if that's something you already get in school, you want to work with your school's guidance counselor or your disabilities coordinator to do the paperwork. They will be the ones who submit that application for accommodations for you. So the only thing to remember is that if you plan to take the SAT, what's nice is you only have to apply once to the College Board company. And then after that, you can use those accommodations on any SAT, AP exam, or PSAT. However, the ACT company is a little bit more complicated. You have to reapply for each ACT you want to take. So if you want to take an ACT in June and in July, that's 2 applications you have to submit. So just keep in mind, it's a little bit lengthy. So you want to make sure you're registering ahead of time because it does take time to process these applications. So again, if it's something you're thinking about, go ahead and get this process started now by talking to your school's counselor. Super scoring, right? So I've taken those tests. I have this score. What else can I do? Super scoring is really great. And so I would say about 85 to 90% of schools in the US will super score the SAT. A slightly smaller amount will super score the ACT. I would still say it's about at 80%. What a super score does is it takes your best of score. Let's say you took the test in March and you got a really good score on the math section. This is the SAT. Took it again in May, but you really weren't feeling well that day, so you didn't really increase either of your sections. That's okay. In June, you really worked hard. You studied and you practiced on the verbal, which is the reading and writing, and you really bumped that score up. And you're so proud of that. But the math, you forgot to study something and it was totally on the test. That's okay. What's going to happen is the schools are going to look at your best of for each section. So they're going to look at the 660 you got in June and the 670 you got in March, and that's going to combine to have a 1330. So again, that means you can combine different section scores over different testing dates. Again, most schools would do this. And again, once you have that school list you've narrowed down, that's when you can start looking at each school. Do they super score? And you can kind of research that. But again, you need to keep in mind, right? What that's going to do is that's going to allow you to take tests multiple times and focus on different sections each time. So how do you prepare, right? So now I know, how the tests work. I know how to register for them. Well, how do I get the score I want? First thing to do is define those score ranges online. So this is one of the biggest things I want you guys to remember. So whatever school you're looking at, for example, I went to UGA. So you're going to type the name of the school into Google. Then you're going to type in the words freshman profile. So what this is going to tell you is schools love to brag about their most recently admitted classes, right? They love that. So most schools are going to have a web page that's going to have all these stats about their most recently admitted freshman class. You're going to have fun stuff like how many countries are they from or something. But it's also going to have stuff like what's their average GPA and what are their SAT, ACT scores. So you're going to look this up for each school you're interested in. If they only have one number on the website, it's safe to assume it's the middle 50th percentile. If they have more than one number, you're going to look at the middle 50th percentile number. That's because, right, let's say this is the range of students. You want to look at the 50% of students in the middle. That's your competitive set. You want your score to be comfortably in the middle of that range to be, competitive, admit to the school. You don't want to look at the bottom 25. Those are often athletes or people who donated a lot of money. And we're not stressing about the top 25, right? We just want to be solidly in the middle here to give us a good chance about getting into that school. So again, that's how you get your baseline to figure out what do I need in the first place, right? Then maybe you need to improve it a little bit, and that's okay. Multiple test dates, right? We already talked about super scoring. So again, maybe you need to bump up your score 30 points. That's okay. You can spread that over multiple test dates with super scoring. Also, by taking tests multiple times, you gain confidence over time, right? Maybe you're super nervous the first time. By the time you take it second time, you know how this works, right? You know how the process goes. You also negate any test difficulties, scoring fluctuation. Again, maybe you forgot to study geometry and there were more questions than usual on it or something. It also allows you to set incremental goals, right? Maybe you need your SAT score to go up 100 points. You're not trying to do that in one go. It allows you to take your time. So our recommendation is to plan for 3 testing dates total. We really haven't seen a huge increase after 3 testing dates. If you only need to go up like a point or two, a 4th test is reasonable, but if you're still trying to go up a large amount of points after 3, it's just not likely to happen, kind of in our experience here at Applerouth. So again, pick 3 testing dates and then go with that. What's nice, this is one of my favorite slides, is you have lots of opportunities to take either test. So you'll see that these are, kind of set up in really nice little groups, right? I said 3 testing dates is really good. Boom, right here, these are great, right? These 3 right here, these 3 SATs. Or even right, April, June, July, ACT, those are a really great little pair too. But you want to make sure you're thinking about what your student has going on. Does your student play a fall sport? This probably isn't a good idea then. Maybe we need to think about March, May, June SAT instead. Is your student always in the spring musical? Does your student go away for summer camp every summer? Which this is not going to work, right? So the thing is that you want to plan this ahead of time. You want to start thinking about this a year or so ahead, right? You want to say, okay, you're probably going to be busy this upcoming fall. So we want to have you take the tests next spring. That way you can make sure you're not on vacation the weekend the test is happening. You can make sure that you guys don't sign up for too much. You also can make sure that you're studying, right? You're not trying to cram everything the night before the test. It definitely does not work with these tests. So planning ahead of time is really your best friend with this stuff. Doing your research, looking at the schools you want to get into, looking at what those test requirements are, and planning ahead of time, again, is going to take a lot of stress off of both you and your student. So again, something to think about. Like I said, this is a really good kind of layout of all the different opportunities you have to take both tests. And you got to take practice tests, right? So the best thing about practice tests is that they're going to mimic the real thing. They can tell you a lot about, how you're doing. Time management, right? Maybe you tend to run out of time towards the end of the reading section. Wrong answer patterns. Maybe you missed every single question about commas. Well, you need to work on your commas, right? So what that's going to do is that's going to allow you to make sure your studying is targeted, right? It's making sure that you're not just doing practice on stuff you're already getting correct, right? If you're really killing it in the reading section, you don't need to do 10 reading passages every week then. You need to be working on something else. So it's going to make it easier, right? Make your studying less stressful. Also make your studying more effective at the end of the day if you know what you need help with, right? So practice tests are a really good tool to both start off your testing process and to check in periodically as you are practicing and studying. Okay, I know that was a lot, right? So we talked about different kinds of applications, what all goes in an application, what the SAT, ACT is, how to work on those scores. So this is going to kind of tie a lot of it together and talk about how a lot of that has changed recently, I know. But we'll kind of talk about how a lot of that stuff is still super relevant. So the big thing is at the end of the day, the new world order is largely test optional. So that means many schools are making test scores optional, right? You don't necessarily need to submit them. But it also doesn't mean that a strong test score isn't going to strengthen your application, right? So we just want to be strategic about it. What does test optional mean? It means the college will consider your application complete even if you haven't submitted scores. If they get your application without scores, they'll say, okay, they didn't mean to send scores. If they get your application with scores, they'll say, okay, they meant to set the scores to us, and we'll look at them. So again, there's no bias there. It just means they'll look at them with or without. But if you think about it, these test scores are optional. There are other things that have been optional this whole time. Technically, taking rigorous classes, submitting strong AP scores, demonstrating interest, becoming president of your clubs. Those have all been optional the whole time, right? We didn't have to do those, but we've been doing those because we know they make a difference. And that's just really what test scores have moved to. They moved from being this requirement to being this other tool to make your application stand out. And that just means we have to be, again, more strategic about how we send them, who we send them to, and what they look like, right? More colleges will be embracing test optional for the long term. We found that about 68% of schools plan to remain test optional. So again, that means it's really largely what it's going to be like for the foreseeable future. At the same time, there have been a historic number of applications sent in post-pandemic too, right? And that's for a lot of reasons. By not requiring tests, you're opening up to students who don't have the ability to take tests, for whatever reason. You're also opening up to students who didn't have the money to take tests, right? There's just so many things here that have opened up these things, and it's easier to apply because you don't have to send test scores. So of course, the number of applications have gone up, right? But if you think about too, think about a school like this bottom, Colgate, which is a smaller school. Their admissions office used to get 8,500 applications, and they got 21,000 a couple of years later. Think about the probably 8-person admissions office dealing with 146% increase in applications. They were probably working overtime for months, right? So just logistically, this increase in applications has made the admissions officers' jobs harder, right? Which means that, selectives have become more selective too, right? Again, more applications. Still, most schools still have the same number of places at the end of the day, right? Unless they build a lot more dorms or they hired a lot more professors, they still have the same number of places. So this has also changed, right? So some of these aren't too big of a difference, but some of them are, right? Scroll down and look at Duke. Duke used to accept 11% of students. Now it's only 4.5%. That's a big difference. Northeastern used to be 20%. Now it's only about 6-7%. At the bottom, Auburn used to take 81% of students. So, for most people, 4 out of 5 people, Auburn was a shoo-in, right? Now it's 50-50. So again, things have certainly changed, which means your applications need to change too, right? They need to be more strategic. They need to be more intentional. IB admit rates plummeted too. Again, they're getting more applications at the end of the day. But if you look at it, the difference between 9.2 and 6.2 for Dartmouth, that's a lot of people who aren't getting in after all, right? So again, right, you want to think about this is changing all around in every kind of school. And with more applicants, fewer test scores, and less certainty, a lot of admissions offices are turning to early decision. We talked about early decision at the very beginning. Do you guys remember? So early decision is when you send in your application early, you promise that you're only applying to this school early, and you promise that if you're accepted, you will go there. So we talked about that. And why would schools want to do that? It's kind of become even more helpful than ever. First of all, those applications are often shorter, right? We talked about that. They're quicker to read. They're easier to read for an overloaded admissions office. That's nice. And you promise you're going to go there. Think about this admissions office. They have 100,000 students applying. They only have 8,000 spots every year. And now it's even harder to sort through them, right? Because test scores, right, pre this, they were kind of convenient for logistics reasons. We can say we're not letting kids in under this test score pretty much across the board. And that, tosses a bunch of applications in the trash and just makes their jobs easier. Now they don't necessarily have that to rely on. They have to really look at every single application. So as an admissions office, it's easier for you guys to look at this smaller group of early decision kids and say, you know what, these kids want to go here. They promise they'll go here. Let's just take more of these than we usually would. And that's what's happening. So look at something like University of Virginia, right? Which is a big state school. 30% of their freshman class was filled with early decision kids. So if you're a regular application student, by the time you're even sending in your application, 30% of the class spots are gone. And that's because, again, it's logistically easier for them to take in these kids' early decision. So we talked about, why would you want to do that? You have a better likelihood of getting in at the end of the day, right? Because schools like this. They like having a guaranteed number of kids coming. So you may want to think, is there a school that I just desperately want? Is there a top school I want to go to? Maybe that is a situation where I would want to use early decision, right? But, if you're not really certain, this could be something you may not want to do. But it's just an option there for you. Again, another tool you can use to make sure your application has the best possible, best possible chance of getting accepted. Why do test scores still matter? I talked about some of the, logistics part of it. Test scores are a hedge against grade inflation. So across the US, that used to be you could only have a 4.0. Now lots of schools allow you to get a 5.0 or a 6.0 or whatever. And lots of schools are inflating their grades, right? High schools like it when their students get accepted into colleges. And if that means they have to give more kids A's than they normally would have beforehand, maybe they'll do that. So really across the US, having all A's isn't super special anymore because schools are inflating these grades. So this is another number they can show, right? These tests, the SAT, ACT, and the AP exams as well, those are third-party objective numbers that are a little bit easier to use to sort these students. Test scores are a strong predictor of graduation within 4 and 6 years. Colleges like this. They like to say this % of our students are done in 4 years. That looks good. That means they supported their students, and test scores, have shown to be helpful in predicting that. They're a really helpful way to compare a broad, diverse group of applicants, like for a state school. Let's say you're a state school. You have one student applying from a more rural area. Let's say their school only offered 6 AP classes. They took all 6 of them, and they're valedictorian. Awesome. You have another student applying from a metropolitan area. Their school offered 15 AP classes. I don't even know if there's that many, but they took all 15, and they were in the top 10% of their class. So even though that one student took more AP classes, it doesn't mean that other students should be seen as below them because that other student took everything they had to offer, right? So test scores are a helpful way to compare these two students who had different opportunities at the end of the day, right? They also help differentiate students who look similar, right? Let's take 2 students from, a metropolitan area. They both took 10 AP classes. They both were valedictorian, right? What are you going to do there? Well, let's say one got a perfect ACT score and one got a 32. 32 is still an amazing score, but it's not a 36. And if you're having to decide between those two kids, the test score can help the other one. So again, it's just a nice objective third-party number to help your application. They are also still required by public colleges in some states. So this is just some examples, right? There are, I'm sure, more across the nation. Also important to remember is that there are some scholarships that are related to this. So for example, I know in the state of Georgia, there is a public scholarship called the Zell Miller Scholarship that pays for 100% of your tuition if you go to a public school. You are required to submit an SAT or ACT minimum score, though, of a certain number. I'm not sure what number. And that's part of it, right? So you want to make sure you're looking up information about your state and making sure you know of these, right? Because if you're like, oh, I'm going to take a test, and all of a sudden you have to take it last minute to get this money, that is so stressful, right? You want to think about this ahead of time. Again, it can affect merit aid, right? Another example, oops, let's skip ahead to this for a second. Another example is University of Alabama. They have this program of scholarships where to get the scholarship, you have to send in a minimum GPA and you got to send in an SAT or an ACT score. Well, let's say you applied to Alabama and you did get 28, but you ended up not submitting the score because you're like, whatever, I think I'll get in, it should be fine, and didn't submit it. You got in, but if you go look at this, you're like, well, if I do go, take 15 minutes and I do go submit that score, I'm getting $10,000. Okay. Even further, if I do a little bit of studying and I bump my score up 1 point or even 2 points, that money goes up, right? It's worth my time to spend a couple hours each week bumping my score up 2 points to more than double that money I'm getting every year, right? So again, once you've made that list of colleges, look into this stuff for each school, look into their scholarship programs, look into their honors college, right? Maybe you want to be in the honors college, maybe a score is required for entry. Every school is different and they all have different requirements for things. You want to make sure you don't lose out on an opportunity simply because you didn't know and you didn't take a test, right? You just want to make sure you are aware of all this stuff. So to go back to the other slide, I think they're out of order, sorry. There's small significant number of colleges that don't use test scores at all. That's called being test blind. So again, it's a very small number of colleges, but just need to keep in mind, if you do see that phrase test blind at any school, that means they do not accept test scores at all and they don't want to see them. Just something to think about as you're doing your research. So after all that, do I send in my test scores? Are they going to add value to your application? Are they something that you want the admissions office to see? For example, you remember that slide earlier that talked about the different kinds of 3.5 GPAs? Let's say you're one of those students who had trouble your freshman year or your sophomore year. You were going through something personal, your GPA dropped, and that really sucked. And it's, you got over it, stuff was better, your score went up, but, your GPA went up, but it's still not where you wish it would be. A strong test score could help tell that story, right? It could help show your growth as a student. I know my GPA is not as high as it should be because I had some stuff going on, but my junior year grades are really great, right? I really came back, and this test score also shows my knowledge and my skills. Again, it's a tool you can use to help tell a story in your application. Another example, right? For like specific programs, right? Let's say, this is just an example, a quote, one university dean talked with showed me that admissions rates were pretty similar to those that with and without test scores, except in STEM and business, where students who had test scores who showed strong, abilities in math got in at a higher rate, right? Those are kind of things to think about. What's the school you're applying to? Also depends on individual section scores, right? So not all 1400s are created equal, right? Let's say you're applying to a selective engineering program. You got 600 verbal and an 800 math in the SAT. The 800 math is a perfect score in math. Send that 1400 in, even if you feel like it's low compared to the other students, because that 800 in math is impressive. On the other hand, let's say you have a 600 in math and 800 in verbal. That's a really cool verbal score. It's awesome that you got a perfect score, but I wouldn't send in that lower math score to this engineering program, right? Maybe to a creative writing program or something. So again, you're thinking about what do the individual section scores say? And am I applying to specific programs where this is going to be important? Again, it depends on your GPA too, right? So we talked about a second ago, students with test scores well below their grades. Let's say you're just a bad test taker, you have bad test anxiety or something, and you're a really great student, but you just can't get a good test score. Maybe it's better if you don't send yours, right? It just doesn't tell a good story of yourself as a student. That's okay. We talked about, better test scores than grades, also a good option. At the end of the day, you can't unsee a weak score in comparison to the rest of your application, right? So it's all about being strategic, right? We want to make sure that we're sure we want to send the score in with a specific application to the specific school we're looking at, right? So again, you're thinking about each school differently. You're not sending in the same application to 20 schools. You're crafting it for each school, which means it just takes more time. Again, you're more strategic. It takes more intention here, which is more time consuming, really, at the end of the day. Okay, I know it was a lot. We're almost to the end, but I'm excited to take your questions. Talk about just a couple more things. There are a couple changes coming up in the SAT world. All right, as we need more, if we need more stuff happening. There's no more subject tests and no more essay, and digital testing will be starting on the SAT. So digital testing for international students starts this March, and then digital testing for US-based students starts next March in 2024. Although a lot of students taking the PSAT this fall in October of 2023 in the US will experience a digital test. So keep an eye out on that. We do have a whole other webinar about the digital SAT that I encourage you guys to sign up for if you want to learn more. It goes into really in-depth into it. But just something to be aware of that is going to be changing. And it could be for the better, right? Your student may love the digital test. So just something to keep an eye out for. I do recommend signing up for the Applerouth newsletter. We release information as we find out about it. So definitely do that to keep up to date on these changes. And again, we're ready, right? We've been in business for over 20 years. We've changed with all the different changes that the tests have given us over that time. We currently offer digital SAT and ACT practice tests. And as we learn more, we'll release prep materials and adaptive testing and help you prepare for the new ways the test is coming out. So before we go to the Q&A, you're going to get a quick poll in your chat. So if you guys don't mind filling that out for us, just helps us learn a little bit more about you and how we can better help you guys out. Go ahead and fill that out for us. Okay, awesome. Okay, so now I'm ready. Go ahead and submit your question through the Q&A function. If there's anything you want me to go back and recap or recover, I'm also happy to do that. Awesome. Okay, so one question came in. What are the elements of a strong essay? Oh, that's a good question. So I will say this is probably a little bit of an annoying answer. That's a question that requires a totally different presentation, right? So what I would do for that, it depends on a lot of things, right? It depends on the prompt, it depends on the school, depends on the student too, right? I mean, a strong essay is going to have nice, concise, clear writing, right? It's going to have strong writing and it's going to get the point across without rambling too much. Often essays are going to have character limits. And it's going to make a strong impression. Of course, it's not super helpful because it's not super concrete advice. What I would do is I would work, kind of go to your student's college counselor. They can kind of help them refine their essay. I also encourage you to go online. Sometimes schools will share good admissions essays. A lot of places online share like good essays. They're a good place to start to get an example of what that looks like. But again, I would work with your school's college counselor and perhaps even their English teacher to kind of work on figuring some of that out. So that's not super helpful. It's not super concrete, but hopefully those are some good steps to take. Okay, is there a way to improve your scores if you are a bad test taker? Yeah, definitely. So a couple different things I'd recommend there. I'd recommend first by starting by taking a test, right? And seeing what your baseline is. Taking a practice test is even better because you can actually look at the answers and see what you're missing more, things on. Maybe it's just that you haven't studied geometry in a while. You're not a bad test taker. You just totally forgot that stuff. You need to go study it, right? And see what's going on there, right? Seeing what kind of questions you're missing. And then from there, that could be where something like Applerouth comes in handy or something else, right? Thinking about strategies, things like that, right? So I recommend just practicing and trying to focus your studying. And then if you feel like you do need more help, looking for a class you can take or something like that, or, a strategy book or something you can read, that's what I'd recommend starting. Do all schools close applications before the end of fall semester? If so, then the senior grades don't seem to matter. So yes and no, right? So senior grades don't matter a whole lot. The only thing I would keep in mind, some schools do rolling admissions, right? And so they'll continue to take admissions through the summer. So some schools, perhaps you end up wanting to apply to a school late or something. Also, your high school will send out like a final transcript at the end of your senior year. And if something is off, school's not going to like that, right? So just keep that in mind. You don't want to all of a sudden drop from a 4.0 student to a 2.0. Don't get all C's your final semester. But if you're usually someone who gets all A's, you get a B or two, I wouldn't stress too much about it, right? So it's a good question, right? It's kind of just don't, keep a balance there. Don't go too crazy. Okay. If a student wants to prep tutoring during the summer, when would she take the SAT? And does it make a difference between paper and digital? A lot of questions there, right? So I'm going to go back to that slide with the months on it for you. Just give me a second to help us visualize this. Oops, there we go. Okay. So you want to tutor during the summer. Okay. Go backwards. So we're tutoring. So you have lots of options. Again, think about what's going on with your student. Are they in a fall sport or something like that? If they're not doing anything major this fall, then you have all of these options to take, right? Don't take all four. You could do August, October, November, December. You could skip October, skip November, any of those options, right? But if you're doing tutoring in the summer, usually that's a good plan, is to do August and some of the other fall ones. If your student is doing something in the fall, it's okay to tutor during the summer. Maybe come back around in March and May and do like some refresher prep or something. So that'd be my recommendation there, depending on what's going on. Will it make a difference if some is paper and some digital? So the question there, again, annoying answer, but we don't really know yet. So the test will still be the same general content, right? The presentation is different. It's going to be shorter. The passages are going to be shorter as well. So we don't really know, right? So I would figure out if your student is taking a digital PSAT, because that could be a good way to tell what's going on, right? Maybe even take digital PSAT and take a paper SAT this fall and see how they feel about both of those, right? You ask your student, how do you feel about it? If they really like the paper test, and maybe focus on getting those paper tests done here, because by the time it comes around to spring 2024, these guys are going to be digital. It's 2024 to 2030. Hopefully that makes sense. So we don't really know yet. Some students may prefer one over the other. We have no idea. So yeah, I recommend just thinking about seeing if your school is doing digital in this range and see if that's a good opportunity to test out the digital. If a student volunteers at their church or in the community, does it count towards college acceptance, or does it have to be school-related activities? Oh, that totally counts, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you can definitely put that in your list of activities you do. You can write about it in your essay. Absolutely. Yeah. Volunteering is great either way. The only thing I would add to that is often schools have volunteer clubs. So like Key Club or Beta Club, there's a couple different clubs. So one nice thing about some of those clubs is like they help you get like awards for the number of hours you volunteered. This is from personal experience, like Key Club, for example, if you give them a certain number of total hours you volunteered with them and outside of them, you kind of get some cool awards and stuff. So the only thing I would add to that is to looking at something like that just to help amplify it a little bit. And your school's college counselor can absolutely help you figure some of that stuff out. Okay, will it hurt your application if there are very little extracurriculars? It just depends. I know that's so a frustrating answer. Maybe you are just an absolutely stellar student in every way, and the extracurriculars you do are related to that, right? Maybe you are someone who's like not sporty. I'm not sporty. I've never played sports, but you're active in like the Math Honor Society. You're active in the English Honor Society. That's the only two things you have, but those are really, respectable things. You've done really well. Maybe your science fair project was third place. Things like that are, also helpful. I would say don't feel like you have to add a lot of extracurriculars, but again, it's better to be active in one or two over a lot of them. And it's also something you can talk about in your application essay too, right? Maybe you have to work or something, for whatever reason, your family needs you to work. So you can't do a lot of extra clubs. That's totally fine. Talk about that in your essay. Okay, so you were asking about the student's senior year grades, right? In my student's case, they won't be able to help her senior year grades. So not really, right? Yeah, okay. I see what you're asking now. Yeah, so the initial GPA stuff you're gonna send is gonna be through spring junior year, fall senior year-ish, right? Depends on when you submit. If you submit around like late December and mid-December, you'll probably get fall of your senior year grades. So yeah, well, it could help you in some, sorry, I'm thinking this through as I'm looking at this. So some of those regular mission deadlines, her spring of senior year grades won't affect it a lot. But consider a school that does rolling admissions, right? Rolling admissions, a lot of schools will roll right up until August. So if she works really hard and she bumps up that GPA fall or spring of senior year, consider a school that does rolling admissions through the summer. Those could help her in that case. If my college board already approved my accommodations, will it automatically suggest testing sites with those? I don't know, unfortunately. So I would give the college board a call. Their help center is pretty helpful, actually. They're pretty responsive. So I would give them a call and ask that just to be sure. Okay. Can you discuss how schools may handle a student's application? They had lower grades in 9th and 10th grade, and they had high grades the rest of high school, and their SAT, ACT scores are decent. So yeah, I would say, I'm actually going to go back to their slide for you as well. Let's visualize this a little bit. That's good, right? The best thing is that they're improving. That's the best thing you have going there, right? You don't want to see it going down, you want to see it going up. Go back a while, sorry. All right, yeah, this is the slide I'm thinking of. So, right, so you guys are kind of this green line, right? Maybe they had trouble here, but they worked and they were getting way better grades here. Maybe their overall GPA still isn't that great, but you know what I would do again in this situation is use the essay to talk about that. Their SAT, ACT scores are decent. Okay, good, right? I would make sure they're in that middle 50th percentile for the score you're looking at. Make sure they're in the competitive range. But I think that looks good, right? They would think that's good. Again, the student is improving over time. The pretty good SAT, ACT score shows that they have improved. It's an objective number that shows they have improved over time. So I think that's a good story to be able to tell. And again, you can tell that story in the essay and all kinds of other ways too. So that's good. I think you're in a good spot. Okay, sometimes students who are enrolled in magnet programs who have rigorous, harder classes get a lower GPA. How do colleges look at that? So we talked about balance, right? So it's kind of about balance and how low it is and what the situation is. So I would say, let me go to the end. Let me go to the end. Okay. So I would say in that situation, you want to make sure it's balanced, right? Are they getting C's and D's? Or are they getting like low B's? That's kind of the question, right? A student who's in a magnet program who's again, compared to the rest of the students too, right? Maybe their GPA is I don't know, 3.5, but they're like 4th in their class. That's still helpful, right? Because again, that means everyone's having trouble because it's hard. It's a hard program. But you want to make sure, right? Is it C's and D's? Are we talking more A's and B's? Again, right, you just think about the balance here. If the program is so difficult that they're getting C's and D's, I would consider, is there something you can change? Is there extra help you can get? Can you lower the level of one of their classes, right? Again, is it one type of thing that's giving you trouble? Is it, I don't know, a magnet school for STEM, right? Let's say you're in a STEM magnet school, you're really, really great at science stuff, but you're taking calc and it's just kicking your butt. That's okay, it's okay, right? Put extra work into calc. See it, maybe you're in AP calc. Can you drop down to honors calc or something next semester to help boost it? What can you do? So again, I guess it just depends on how lower their GPA is and how it compares to other students at the school. That's also important. And other stuff too, right? How are their extracurriculars? Did their science fair project win first place? That's awesome, right? Other things you can say to fill in some of those gaps. So, okay, it's a good question. Thank you guys for submitting them. So any other questions? All right. So as a reminder, the presentation will be emailed to you guys. I believe the recording will. And so you guys definitely go back and refer to a lot of this. Again, this is a lot of information all at once. But this, if I'm going to leave you with anything, I say just start doing your research and prepping, right? Again, get your list of schools and, what are the test requirements? What are the GPA requirements? What are the options for applications, right? What are the pieces of applications they want? Some schools want different things than others. Okay, so, that's my list of things I need to get. And then from there, right, how does my stuff compare to theirs, right? How does my GPA compare? How do my test scores compare? And then from there, make those decisions about what do I need to work on? Maybe I'm doing early action here, but not here. Maybe I'm doing rolling here. Maybe I am not submitting my test scores to this school, but I'm submitting them to this school. Again, and each application can be different to each school. And that's really what it's kind of become now is, again, you have to really tailor them to each school. So again, my recommendation is to start with that research and get ready. And it's going to save you guys a lot of stress further down the road. So if you guys don't have any more questions, y'all are free to go. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hopefully you join us again another time. Okay, so I got a question. If a student qualifies for Zell or Hope in Georgia, can they receive similar scholarships from colleges outside of the state? So they're not going to receive similar scholarships from like the state, if that makes sense, right? So like if they apply to a school in South Carolina, they're not going to get the equivalent of South Carolina's Hope, if that makes sense, because they're not a South Carolina resident. Maybe, right? So I don't, as far as I know, and I'm here in Georgia too, I don't know of any schools that like say, oh, you would have got Zell, we'll give you something similar. I'm not aware of any things like that. But I mean, schools offer all kinds of different scholarships, right? We saw the University of Alabama example. There are plenty of scholarships out there. And the thing is just looking at those schools and seeing what opportunities there are. Maybe it's just an extra application you have to submit. So I would say just look out for them, right? If you have those kind of cool qualifications that would let you get Zell or Hope here in Georgia, you probably have a good chance of getting something from another school. But as far as I know, there's nothing like that correlates with it, if that makes sense. So I think I answered that. All right, well, we will leave it at that tonight. I hope you guys have a great evening and hope you guys join us again sometime.